quite easily. But if they let it go and don't deal with it, then it moves on to number 2 there. Shift from a disagreement to personal antagonism. So instead of being a problem, they both recognize they're going to solve the problem. Now the problem is the other person. And we start to have bad feelings about the other person. And so now it's hostility between people, not just having a disagreement about a different opinion. If the conflict is not addressed there, then number 3, it starts to get other issues involved. There's an issue proliferation. So instead of just dealing with one conflict, now there's this one comes in, and this one comes in, and this issue comes in. It's hard to deal with a conflict when there's lots of different problems that are related to. So now we've got not only anger, upsetness between people, you're the problem, it's also too many things to have to think about. We don't deal with it then, it moves on to triangle. So a triangle is when I don't talk to the person I have a problem with, I go talk to somebody else. And we talk together about how bad that person is and how their opinion is bad. And I feel better because this other person agrees with me. We form a triangle, but it doesn't solve the problem with the person. We just both blame that person. So it doesn't solve the problem, and now I'm talking about somebody else. If it doesn't get resolved at that point, then we go to 5. There gets to be reaction and escalation, so an eye for an eye. That person does something bad, I do something bad back. That person says something mean about me, I say something mean back. It's kind of like politics in America, is there's a lot of this back and forth kind of eye for eye. But it happens in churches sometimes too, right? This kind of escalation. If that doesn't get taken care of, if it keeps growing, then there gets to be real antagonism and hostility, anger, upsetness. This happens in churches sometimes, lots of anger, lots of hostility. And if that continues, the conflict continues to grow, and you get people on your side and that other people get people on their side, now you have 2 groups of people that are antagonistic to each other and very angry and upset at each other. And this can be very destructive and can even result in violence. But in churches, this kind of, you get polarization, the churches and the 2 groups fight, maybe not physically, but verbally and things like that. But this happens in communities, it happens in churches. So you can see that the less trust over on those arrows, the less direct contact between people, the less communication that's accurate, there tends to be more violence, and it grows as the conflict escalates. This also gives us, well, first of all, tells us to try to deal with conflicts early before they start to grow and note what's happening if it's escalating out. But it also tells us that the way toward peacefulness or building peace is to go the opposite direction. So try to get more accurate communication between the parties. Work on getting more direct contact between the parties that are having difficulty with each other. Try to do things that will build trust with each other, and that will, and definitely try to stop the violence, ceasefire or whatever, and bring the violence down. So de-escalating conflict is the opposite direction as what this thing shows, where it shows a conflict getting worse and worse and worse. Any questions about that? Something to be thinking about, a tool for you to look at. Okay, there'll be discussion time later if you want to. If you could move on to the second PowerPoint. Yes.
Number 3.
Number 3, yes.
That
yes.
one.
Yes.
Issue of proliferation.
So a lot of times conflict starts out with one area that we're in disagreement, one issue we don't see eye to eye. This can happen in a church or in a community. And then if we don't resolve that one, then other things get added into it. This happens in a marriage too. So if you've ever had a conflict or argument in a marriage, you disagree about something, and maybe you don't have any arguments in your marriage, I don't know. You disagree about something, and if you don't know how to solve that one, then all of a sudden we bring in something from before about something else, and then we bring in something else to talk about, and all of a sudden we can't solve anything because there's too many different kinds of disagreements. I don't know if it's normalized or it just like spreads out to be a great big problem. It's not just one thing to solve. All of a sudden it's like 6 things we're trying to solve at the same time. You talk about one thing and then they bring in a different issue. Then you talk about that. Then you bring in a different issue. Talk about that. Nothing gets solved. And that's how some churches do. It's also how some marriages do when they are getting into trouble. Yeah.
Is it like something bringing the past to the present problem?
Yes.
That happens a lot in our churches, even among the leaders.
Yeah.
Mai kan ma lai mi karlak no issue kan nei mi sik te karwa chana lan lio ngak saliwa nan rak simina ka tu te ka ma lio hi te kan ti til rem khau ti lo kan rem khau ti lo chu bentuk na le ma ka udi ni pa ni ban hal mi ka tha tuk mi sik kan ma shim kha chin nu mi chu kan ton mi kha problem solving tu alowi asan lio kong kha ma lio zo hi tin na city te ka kan problem kha generalize letik mana kan solve khau ti lo kan la chute. Thank you.
Good, thank you. Yeah, that helps a lot because it often is bringing in stuff from the past that causes it to spread. So could you change the next PowerPoint back in the room? Change to conflict transformation and mediation in the Bible. And did you get this one? Okay, very good. No? Okay. You have that one? Yeah. Yeah, session 2.
Session 2. Yeah, good.
I'm trying to look and see what's the timing here? What do we go to? I lost my paper. 11:12. Okay. Okay, so we are going to take the next 45 minutes or so to talk about some of the stories of conflict that we find in the Bible and to see how they were transformed or resolved. So first we're going to take a look at the teaching of Jesus and learn what to do in a conflict with someone. Then we're going to look at 2 conflicts that happened in the early church. You know, sometimes we feel like there shouldn't be conflict in the church, right? We know there is, but we shouldn't, but somehow it just is not possible. We're different, and so there's going to be conflict in the church. And they had a lot of conflict in the early church as well. And it's not that we're failing when that happens. Then we're going to look at some Old Testament passages where it's going more into the community and avoiding violence and war. So we're going to look at a number of different passages. If we have any like New Testament or Old Testament scholars here, we're not going to do deep exegesis, but we're going to use them as examples, okay? So the first one is a teaching by Jesus in Matthew 18. Okay. It's a very familiar passage to you. Let me just read it really quickly here. I may not read all of them, but this one's a short one. So Matthew 18:15 through 17. If another member of the church sins against you, go and point out the fault when the 2 of you are alone. If the member listens to us, you have regained that one. But if you are not listened to, take 1 or 2 others along with you, so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If the member refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if the offender refuses to listen even to the church, let that one be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, what you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Okay, so in this passage, Jesus is talking in specific terms about a conflict between two people. And it's two people that are in the church or in the community together, in which a person has done something wrong that's created separation and alienation between these two people. In most conflicts, it feels like the other person has done something wrong, right? And so very often when we're conflicts, usually we think that the other person did something. We might have, but we don't think about that. Although Jesus does talk about that somewhere else. But in this situation, we think they've done something wrong, and so what does Jesus tell us to do? Because when you feel that way, there's tension between you, right? There's problems between you when you feel like that other person has done you a wrong thing. So first is, he says, we should go directly to that person and talk to them about the problem that we're feeling. Now, this can seem like a pretty obvious way to solve a problem. If I'm having a problem with someone, a disagreement, then I should go to that person and talk about that disagreement, right? But it's kind of hard to do that sometimes, isn't it? It's hard, maybe you think it's your culture, but I think it's any culture that can be a hard thing to do. So it's much easier, really, to talk to someone else if we're having trouble. I think it's difficult to go to a person because it involves others. What needs to happen? How can we make things better? And how can we hold both parties accountable? So we might think of these other ones, these other witnesses, that one or two you bring along, as mediators. Coming in, you can't solve it one-on-one, so you bring in one or two other people to help the two of you solve it. This is what counseling is a lot of times, couple counseling, but this also can happen within our congregations as well. If that doesn't help, then Jesus goes on to say we should seek help from our faith community. Faith communities are supposed to be places of reconciliation where we learn how to deal with conflict. So in that situation, there's more people, there's potentially more wisdom, more perspectives. We'll look at Acts 15 to see how this maybe could work. And then finally it says that that doesn't work, then treat that person as a Gentile and a tax collector. So what does that mean? What does it mean to treat a person as a Gentile and a tax collector? I think sometimes the church has thought that means throw the person out. But that's really not how Jesus treated tax collectors and Gentiles. What did Jesus do? Jesus ate with them, right? He got criticized for it. He ate with tax collectors. He sat down at the table and built relationships with tax collectors despite their differences. And so I think what it's suggesting, and John Lederer says this, is that, okay, we can't solve the conflict right now. We've tried our best to do that. Then we still don't give up hope. And we still do what we can to reach out and try to be building the relationship, trying to be building a little bit of trust, trying to be open to that other person. And hopefully in the future, those the ones that we say treat like a tax collector, people that have been estranged will be able, there'll be a hopeful, a better ending in the future. Okay, so that's one way to understand what we do in our conflicts with individuals like that. So what's tricky about this is how do we talk to one another to have a good outcome? If we go to somebody to have a conversation about something that we feel they've done that's wrong, or at least that we feel really hurt or angry or upset about. So how do we do that in a way that is going to work? Because it's not going to work if we go up to a person and we say, you did this thing wrong and I really feel upset, and it's not going to work, right? They're just going to get defensive. So what might work? Yeah.
And in First Corinthians chapter 5, Paul also said that if someone sin against very severe sin, he was to be removed from the community. So how do you think about excommunication or disfellowship for the betterment of the community? Or is that confusing, or I don't know if it's related to your lecture?
Yeah, churches have done really through history different things with that excommunication. You know, and I can only speak from my my perspective and my church perspective. I think there is a place for asking someone to leave the church if it endangers other people or if it's destroying the church. So if there is an extreme example, maybe somebody has been abusive toward a child or sexually abusive toward someone or is causing so much destructive talk, that it's just destroying the whole community. So you go through the process and you try to do all these things to bring that person back and try to help them do better. Actually, with the abusive situations, that is difficult because often if people are at a point where they're abusing, they don't do better very well or very quickly. But so you work at that, but there I feel, I don't call it as much maybe excommunicating, but it may be appropriate for that person to leave. You can't come to this church. We have to protect the more vulnerable. So I can see that there is a place for that at times. I would suggest that when it's possible, it would still be good to maintain some kind of maybe relationship with that person and still trying to pull them closer to God and closer to dealing with their problem and all of that. So to use excommunication as a punishment, I see that as maybe less helpful than using it as kind of more of a protection of those and then trying to work separately. So, in our context, if there's if there's been domestic violence, a man has been beating on a woman and they're members of the church, he's a member of a church. Sometimes we have restraining orders here in this country. It may be that man can't attend the same church as the woman because even the restraining order, but in protection of her, it's too hard to have someone who's been beating and abusing her. So there are situations where, for the good of the church or individuals, one needs to ask to leave and then try to. The problem is when you're a pastor of one church, then you often lose contact, with this person. They wander off, and sometimes they go to another church and cause the same problem. So, does that help at all?
Yeah.
Okay.
I just want to add one question.
Yes. Yeah.
In Baptist perspective, is excommunication common, or in our missionary experience in Tuesday, they always use the excommunication method.
And what would they excommunicate people for? What kind of?
A member is drunk,
Ah.
and then sometimes a member commits some kinds of sin,
Sin,
and they communicate from the church. And then what is the Baptist tradition about the excommunication?
Yeah, I don't know historically, but the present practice in this context is I don't think excommunication is used really at all. But I think probably historically, different times it has been used. So I actually, when I was growing up in Tanzania, they did some of that in churches, like if a woman got pregnant out of marriage or something like that. It was a way of expressing the church's disapproval and encouraging other people not to do that thing. And I think in the early church when that happened, it was, and maybe this would still be true in Chin community or in Chin State, is that the whole community is the church community is so important that to be asked to leave that community for a time was experienced as really bad, as really painful. It would help people see their sin and come to repentance and then want to change their ways. So if it's for the purpose, again, of bringing a person back in, it seems like it potentially has a role. In a context like in this country, if you would excommunicate someone from a church, they'd just go to another church. There wouldn't be anything else there's tons of churches all over the place. They're not in contact with each other. It wouldn't have the same effect. They would just be mad at your church. So you have to kind of think contextually about what is the purpose of doing that, what is the goal to achieve. Our goal is always, the well-being of the church and the well-being of the individual, and it's different.
The one that you mentioned last night. Last night you talked about the conflict in Kenya, and now we are dealing with individual. But what I'm asking right now is, can we integrate this concept with your own experience of dealing conflict in Kenya, which might be helpful to what we have been going through right now? Yesterday in your sermon, you touched some of those things. Yeah, and I was really thrilled to hear that, because we are in the process of dealing with the conflict between those ethnic groups.
Yeah.
And
Well, let's keep going here. I know that you're eager to get there, and I maybe should have gotten there quicker.
sorry,
gonna
I think
get there.
I'm
No.
quick.
Oh, I love when people are eager to get to where we want to go, right? So thank you for bringing that up, though. Actually, in preparing, wasn't sure how much you wanted that emphasis and how much you wanted just kind of more general emphasis. So I do have some general stuff that relates to life, but actually these same things do relate to national conflicts as well, working toward reconciliation. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about what's called nonviolent communication. Marshall Rosenberg has developed this and used it in many different countries, Africa, Middle East, the United States, and the overall goal of nonviolent communication. So we're talking about how do we talk to others that we're in conflict with. The overall goal is to build a connection of interpersonal relationship, a connection that's trustworthy in order to try to transform that conflict. And what this requires is both an authentic connection with ourselves, that is, we're speaking honestly, we know what we think and feel, we're speaking honestly from our own experience. An empathic reception of others, that is, without blaming them right away, we're trying to receive from them what it is that their experience is. And then an honest expression, speaking honestly, speaking the truth in love to the other person so that they know what our experience is. Okay, so we're going to talk about 4 basic skills in this nonviolent communication. First of all is observation. So this involves sharing information about the words or actions of another person that's affecting us without blaming them and criticizing. It's like if you were describing what's on a videotape, if you had videotaped the interaction. It's just describing without evaluating, without criticizing. Evaluating or blaming causes people to be defensive, and they want to fight back. It doesn't help them to listen to you and try to understand why you're feeling that way. So the first thing is observing. So it would be like when can I talk to you about something? When I saw you outside the other day and I waved and I said hi, you turned around and walked the other direction. Okay, I want to talk to you about this. That's an observation. It's something that just happened. Okay? Feeling. Feeling is becoming aware of what something caused us to feel, right? And our feelings help us understand what we need. So it's important for us to think about those feelings, and then when we're clear on them, to share that. So when I saw you just turn away after I waved, I felt kind of confused, but I also felt really hurt. So then need. Need is identifying the need beneath the feelings. The feelings are dependent on that. So in this situation, it would be like I felt really hurt and confused because I really feel like I need to have a relationship with you and to have your respect and to be your friend. I thought, so sharing what some needs are, and then a request. Can we talk about this so that I can understand your situation? Okay, so it's not blaming them right away. It's just something that happened to us, something they did. It could be like in a meeting. Somebody brings up an issue, you're the pastor, someone brings up an issue, and you never heard about this issue before, and you're in the big council meeting or whatever, and they bring up the issue and it causes a big controversy. Maybe afterward you say, observation, at the meeting last night, I saw that you brought up this issue, okay? I felt really caught unaware and surprised, and because I didn't know that this was a problem, and I really need to know about these things ahead of time so that I can think about how to best deal with this situation. Would you be willing next time to come to me ahead of time and share with me your concerns so we can talk about them and we can plan the best approach in the council meeting? So we're trying to approach it in a way that's not angry and blaming. Does this make sense, what I'm saying here? This is nonviolent communication. Observation, feeling, expressing our needs, and then asking for something that will help to make the situation better. So, honest expression, okay, we just went through this. Honest expression really is speaking the truth in love. And Ephesians 4 talks about needing to do that. And when we're really upset, it's hard to do that, right? Whoops, I'm sorry. I am really having trouble, aren't I? Okay. Well, anyway, you know where I'm trying to be, right? Here. Okay, so when we're upset and we're ready to blame or judge, slow down. Take a big breath and take some time. Translate your judgments into observations. You want to evaluate and judge it because you know what it means, right? Translate it to an observation. Translate your opinion in your interpretation into your feelings and into your needs, and then translate demands into requests. And this kind of lowers the temperature a little bit. Empathy is what's needed in this. Empathy is this discipline setting aside your own feelings a little bit in order to connect with the other person's unique feelings and needs, and it helps you then to guess what they're feeling. It's really trying to, what do they feel? What do they think? And that means putting aside yourself a little bit. Authentic dialogue can transform a conflict, but it requires these things: honest expression, empathy, self-empathy. The goal is to have mutual understanding and connection. It's not to right away change someone, but to understand someone. It's trying to focus on the conditions where everybody's needs are met. And authentic dialogue is needed oftentimes before we can get to an actual solution. Okay, so let's move on. Acts 6. We're going to look at this one. This is a very familiar conflict in the church. Maybe I won't read it all, but it was where there were two groups. The Hellenists were the dominant, you could call them the mainstream group, and there were the Hebrews, and then the Hellenists were the minority group. They were on the margins, and their interests were being overlooked here. And the conflict related to what was perceived to be an unjust distribution of food to the widows of the Hellenist group, to the marginal group. So what did they do? What did they do? Although it's hard for someone on the margins to speak up, right? It's hard. They did bring their request to the 12 about this injustice that was happening within their community. And the 12 listened. You didn't coo it off. They took their complaint very seriously and recognized what their need was. And they decided to call the whole community together and take some kind of action and get some kind of plan together to address the unjust situation. And what this conflict did, it helped them to clarify what their role was as the 12. Really, instead of distributing the food, they should be focusing on, preaching and prayer and on the message, and somebody else needs to take over this role, because obviously they weren't quite doing it well, right? If we try to do everything, we don't always do it well. So they were clarified in their calling and role by this conflict, and they empowered the congregation to choose 7 others to lead this ministry of food distribution. And in deep concern to those who had brought this complaint of injustice in this church made up of these 2 groups, all 7 of those chosen to distribute the food in this ministry were Hellenists, we know, because they have Greek names. All of them have Greek names. So instead of holding on to power, they took seriously those who were on the margins. They took seriously the injustice that they were expressing and listened to them and empowered them. And then we read that the result was renewed unity and growth within the church. That was one way they dealt with a conflict that could have really split up the church. Well, let's look at another very familiar conflict. Oops, I already did that. And that is Acts 15. Very familiar passage probably to you. Again, it's a long passage, so I'm not going to read it all, but this was really a significant conflict in the church involving some core issues about the very identity of God's people. And what they were to believe and practice as a result of God seeming to be doing a new thing, and new people, Gentiles, coming into the church. The early church was all Jewish, right? They're all Hebrews. They all had the same culture. And now all these other cultural groups, actually some of them that we regard as enemies, but they were coming to Christ. Gentiles, what do we do with this situation? And our rules, how do they apply to this new situation, our religious rules? So they say if you read the text, it said it was no small conflict. There's strong feelings, there was confusion, there was disagreement, but they seemingly were able to work it out in a way that promoted the church's unity and transformed it for future mission. So again, in a book that John Paul Lederach has written a lot of books, but here are some of the steps that he kind of pulls out of this passage. First of all, we need to recognize and define the problem. Okay, conflict can go along in a church for a long time without even acknowledging it, or in a community, hides under the surface. So the first step to dealing with it is acknowledging the differences and come to some kind of understanding that this is a problem and we need to deal with it. Secondly is to create the appropriate forum for processing matters. That means we need to think through how are we going to deal with this? And especially if we move to like a more compromised or kind of collaborating position, how are we going to meet together? Who needs to be here as part of this discussion? So creating an appropriate forum and high participation often is the most helpful. Then diverse viewpoints need to be represented. We see that in this passage in Acts 15. Paul spoke up, and someone else spoke up their experiences about the situation. So the diverse opinions were represented from both sides of the issue, the ones who were wanting everybody to become Jews in order to become Christians or Jewish lifestyle, and the ones who didn't. And then the diverse voices are given space to speak. There's opportunity to speak, the different people who had different kinds of opinions, and that's what most of the chapter is about, is what they say to each other. Then use the gifts of the community while working out the process. So in this situation, someone was talking about his experience of Gentiles coming to God, and it must be that God is working for that to happen. Someone else was talking about Scripture and reinterpreting Scripture, the Old Testament, so that it applied to the situation they're in. And then James comes in and kind of summarizes the whole thing and has an opinion or has a suggestion. Really, he kind of states what they'll do. In that context, that was appropriate. And then, once that happens, decide upon and implement the decisions. So they gathered people together who were part of the different communities, and they shared what the decision was, and they sent representatives back, and they told them what the decision had been. And it was, so it wouldn't be offensive, but not overly burdensome to those who were Gentiles and becoming Christians. So their plan was implemented. And through this process, really this attentive listening to each other, they really did listen. It says it in the text, they listened to each other. Through that process, then they were able to hear what God's voice, they discerned what would be the voice of God. So those are also some principles we can think about for dealing with conflict, particularly within the church. Let's turn, I know I'm zipping through scripture pretty fast here, but let's turn to a couple of passages which may be a little bit less familiar. And in due of time, I'm going to summarize them, and then I'm going to encourage you to read them once you go home. But 1 Samuel chapter 25. Oh, I was going to say this. I didn't have it in my notes. Richard Jack has written a book on conflict, Transforming Church Conflict. And he says, when conflict happens, say, we are entering a new growing stage in the church. God has blessed us with diverse gifts, insights, and callings, and God is now blessing us with new questions to explore and problems to solve. That's a positive way to look at conflict in the church, isn't it? Yeah. The outcome of a well-managed conflict is a congregation that has greater clarity about its mission and new skills and energy to achieve it. If we don't take care of conflict in the church, it takes a lot of energy. It gets us off course from our mission. Okay, 1 Samuel chapter 25, verses 1 to 35. And here we see a passage that shows the importance of taking the initiative to do what we can to head off violence and to enlist others who may be wise and have the connections and power to do that. So here's the story. We find this is before David became king, and he was living the life of a fugitive in the wilderness with King Saul trying to kill him. David had gathered a band of warriors and really social outlaws together, and they survived by foraging and by begging and a little bit by plundering. And apparently they've been camping out near the sheep herders of a wealthy man named Nabal and providing them with protection. But when David sent some men, let me see if I have some of this written down. When David sent some men, to get some food, they were slaughtering and they were going to have a feast, and David said, we've been protecting your sheep herders all these days and nothing has happened to them, and we've been really good to them, so can we have some food too? Can you share with us? And Nabal just insulted David, the owner of all this wealthy man. He was like, who's David and how do I know he's just not someone who's escaped from his master? And David was really insulted. He was really angry. And so he decided that he was going to kill all of Nabal's men. He gathered up 400 of his men, followers, left a couple hundred to stay with what the stuff they had, and he planned to kill every man related to Nabal because he had been insulted and he was furious. So what happened? What happened was there was a young man who heard about this, maybe was there, and he could see what was coming, violence, big violence, and told Abigail, Nabal's wife. Now he knew himself, he's just a little, he might be a tall man, but he had no power. He was a little person. And so he knew himself, he couldn't stop David. But he knew that Abigail was a wise woman. And he knew that Abigail also was of a higher status, could maybe talk to David, and also was the wife of Nabal. So he thought, I need to let her know. So he runs to her and tells her what's happening. And Abigail, who is wise, quickly puts together all this food, tons of food for everybody, puts it on donkeys, and goes out to meet David before David would get to the man that he's going to slaughter. And what she does, as soon as they come close, she gets off her donkey and she falls down on the ground and bows before him, takes all the responsibility onto herself, apologizes. This is appeasement, right? This is definitely accommodation. This is an emergency situation where there's a lot of danger, and that's what she did. And so she also, beside the apologizing, she encouraged David to see that actually it was in his best interest not to slaughter all these men. He was going to be king, and it wouldn't be good to have this blood on his record. So she kind of put herself in David's place in some ways to see how he might be able to think about this situation, and showed him a peaceful solution to the problem. And we read in this passage that David listened to her and appreciated her helping him restrain his anger. He accepted her gifts, and then he let her go in peace. This is a very nice story of how really someone in kind of an in-between role, mediating role, was able to avert violence by quick action, taking the initiative, reaching out to someone, and that person being a wise person and knowing what to do. Let me talk about one other story, and then we'll probably be time to stop. So Joshua 22 is another story. This is kind of a complicated story. Joshua 22, starting with verse 10 to 34. And in this story, let me just tell you about it. If we had lots of time, you could delve deeply into it. But this has to do with a misunderstanding between groups of people that had the potential for becoming a war between these two groups of people. It's a long passage. After the conquest of Canaan, the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh decided to settle on the east side of the River Jordan, while the rest of the Israelites tribes settled on the west side of the river. In time, these 2.5 tribes built an altar near the Jordan River. And then we read that these other 10 tribes, they got ready for war. And you think, what's going on here? That building an altar is making these mobilize to fight and to have war with this other group. But before going to war, the Israelites, these 10 tribes, sent the priest Phinehas, along with the chiefs of these 10 tribes, to talk to these 2.5 tribes about building this altar. So before war, trying to figure out what's going on, sent kind of mediators or negotiators to figure out what's going on. And that was really good that they talked before they just attacked and assumed they knew what was going on. Phinehas kind of is blaming. He assumes he knows what's going on, and he's kind of getting on them. Why are you doing this and all of this? But at least they're talking. The people, the 10 tribes were very afraid that this altar was being built because these 2.5 tribes were going into idolatry. They were going to serve another god and not stay with their faith that they held in common. And through the wilderness experience, people had experienced some pretty brutal things, plagues and military defeats and all this kind of stuff that they understood to be God's punishment of them for being unfaithful. So they were fearful that that would happen. On the other hand, when they were confronted with this understanding, these 2.5 tribes were like, no, that's not what it was at all. We were afraid that in time, your children would not recognize that our children are part of the Jewish religion together and wouldn't allow them to come and worship. So we built this altar that is a copy of the kind of altar that is used to offer the sacrifices to God as a witness that we're all serving God together. Okay, so this side was afraid, this side was afraid. They hadn't talked initially, so that there was like misunderstandings, and they almost went to war if they had not sent the delegation of people to come and discuss the situation. Once they realized what that fear was about and why those actions had occurred, the conflict eased and disappeared. And Phineas and the 10 chiefs go back to the people and explain, and they're glad it's okay. And the 2.5 tribes name the altar witness as a reminder that it is a witness to both groups that God is the Lord. So this story reminds us it's easy to project our fears on others and interpret their actions in a way that really might not have any basis for reality, to interpret in a way that is negative and blaming and would cause us to respond even violently. But in this situation, they checked it out. They talked first, and that resulted in good communication, win-win situation for them. So to wrap up, and I'm a few minutes later, I realize, but stages of mediation, we can kind of see them in this story. Introduction, for mediation to occur, there needs to be a safe place for parties to get together and talk. It needs to be safe for both parties. They feel comfortable. There needs to be time we call storytelling. Each side expresses their side of the situation and concerns and listens to the other side as they talk about it. Together, when they see the problem, they identify what the issue is, and they generate or they make suggestions for what they can do. What are the different options, and evaluate them and negotiate them. And then an agreement, if all goes well, an agreement is worked out that is fair enough so that both sides feel like this will handle the situation. And I think pastors and church leaders can be in that role of mediator for many kinds of situations. They're the person that's kind of objective, or they're trying to treat each group fairly. And they can help to kind of clarify communication, discuss the process that is okay for both sides that are having trouble, where they can meet, who should be there, how it should go. They can be, in the process of that, they can be sure to be listening, allow feelings to be expressed, point out where there's common ground between the two groups, acknowledge the good intentions of both, encourage them to speak direct to each other. Sometimes when you're needing to, when you're mediating, and like marriage counseling is mediating a lot of times, but this can happen with groups as well. They talk just to you. They just talk to the mediator. Sometimes you need to tell them to talk to each other, when it's the appropriate, when it seems right to do that. Assist them to listen to each other. That takes a lot of kind of help sometimes. And then facilitate building the relationship. And then there's problem-oriented activities, drawing out the needs and interests, and thinking about the options for the solution. So I think it's time for discussion. I have one little story if there's time later, but maybe we'll go with this in the last little story if we get to it, and we'll do it otherwise the next time. Also has to do with a transformative initiative, which we're going to talk
discussion ka bantuan hao sila te bihal dumi siang lo mina num soal mo salale hal du mina ka ban kut ban sir do hal ding nang ngai lo mo okay kai
As you mentioned earlier, sir, the book of Acts chapter 6, the book of Acts chapter 6. So, apostle appointed by the 7 peoples, Hellenists. So, how do you think about
many people said that they were deacons. So how do you think about they were exactly deacon or not? Yeah, that's I would like to also, that's why.
It looks like in this passage, their job, I mean, yeah, they are, I think that is the word that's used in some translations. Okay. So it says, friends, select among yourselves 7 men of good standing, full of the Spirit and wisdom, that we may appoint to this task, the daily distribution of food, while we on our part will devote ourselves to prayer and for serving and to serving the world. And so they were pleased that the whole community chose Stephen, and they go on to talk about. It doesn't really say here, I don't think. I mean, it sounds like part of the ministry is the distribution of food. And actually, I don't know how deacon is understood as much within your culture, but I know in our, the deacons in the churches I work with often have that fund, that emergency fund to help people in need. So that was part of the work of these people. And it could be this was the beginning of the deacons. I think oftentimes when we talk about deacons, this is the passage that is referred to. But it emerges out of a response to deal with a perceived injustice. Isn't that interesting? To make the church more just and also to meet the needs of the widows.
ค่ะปัญหาที่เขา
What's that?
พี่หมอเห็น
Thank you for the presentation. Yes, those are the beautiful fundamental disciplines of conflict resolution. I am happy to hear your lecture, but my main concern is about Burma. In this kind of session, if you give time to discuss the problems in Burma and how to solve the problem, and then from us, we need to understand what will be the way to solve the problem. In our mind, as of now, we are dreaming that the revolution from our side will be winning. Not win-win, but one side win. So in that case, how do you evaluate the situation in Burma?
Okay, I'm going to just talk about a little bit of a different concept, and I don't have a slide right off for it, but this is also Paul Lederich. And he's done a lot of writing about peace building. So even though the conflict is going on in Burma, I know you are thinking about what's next. Religious leaders, pastors need to be thinking about what's next, not just that the Chin people or the people will win the war there, because what's going to happen after the fight, you know? So So look here. He says there's 3 levels of peace building that need to happen. This top level is kind of the chief leaders of the different parties, okay? So I know you've got, I'm not sure of everything that's being done, but I know you've got kind of like a president in exile, right, that's working. And so the leaders of both sides need to be negotiating, trying to build a peace process. I don't know if that's happening at all between military and the people that are fighting the military. But there is this top level that kind of, I mean, the violence has to stop before peace can happen, right? So there's just violence going on, and it just continues on. So at some point, there needs to be some kind of channel opened up between the two groups fighting. And I don't know if that's even opened up at all in Burma, or if there's been any kind of effort to communicate. Do you know? Nothing, yeah, nothing else. So that you bring up a really good point. This can often, right, has to have some kind of mediator or peace person doing it.
Military junta always break the agreements. So there's no trust between the leaders.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
It's a big
Yeah.
problem.
I think they had peace talk maybe some 10, 12 years ago, and then they have also peace agreement, but the military junta always break the agreement, and there's no trust
Yeah.
from the other part of parties, I mean, from
Yeah,
leaders.
it's a
That's the
very
problem.
entrenched situation. So that needs to be happening somehow, working toward that. And I mean, some of these other conflicts in the world, you do hear once in a while, one country, like it's Qatar, I think, is what jumped in to negotiate with the hostages and the Israeli Hamas. Sometimes, a country will be willing to send their negotiators. And if you have someone neutral that's trying to talk with both sides, you can't talk with each other at this point in a really entrenched, violent conflict, but they try to talk with both sides. Okay, so that doesn't sound like it's happening, and it needs to happen before the fighting stops, probably, unless one side definitely wins, and then the other side gets just pushed down. But there's two other levels here. And this level, the bottom level is the grassroots level. And pastors in Myanmar could easily be part of that. They're really seeing and experiencing the destructive of the violence. And they're close to the people. And on this level, preparing for peace is helping people to understand how to resolve conflicts, how to do those things that's going to build a peaceful society. So it's like what you're talking about with Wilson in Kenya. That's what he was doing on this level. He was having these training sessions to teach people conflict transformation skills, getting people, I think even in Burma, it may be that you have so many different groups that even if you weren't fighting the military, perhaps, afterward, you're still going to have to get along with everybody else, So there is a need to learn these peacemaking skills for all of the different ethnic communities to be able to work together as a unified group in peace. So this level, there are things that can be done. Now it's hard, people are on the run and they're hiding in the forest or the jungle. I understand at certain points it's just survival. But at the grassroots level, to build peace, you can't just dictate peace from the top. Have a ceasefire, now we're not going to have any more violence. We also need to be training people about how to live in a peaceful manner, how to resolve conflict, dialogue, how to listen, all of those. And this middle group is kind of the ones that are in between. They're kind of in contact with the leaders. They're kind of in contact with the leaders of the grassroots. They might be, I'm not sure in Burma, but in many countries it might be like the ministers of education or the minister of refugee services or something like that, they're able to kind of connect a little bit to. So these guys up here, they don't really experience the violence. They're just giving the orders, right, or making the decisions. These people are suffering greatly, but this part also needs to be, peace forums, training in problem solving. So there are things we can be doing even while we're waiting for some kind of ceasefire. But to truly get to more peace, it is going to be needed at some time to have a ceasefire, and then you build trust, and then you try to hold it. And I know it's discouraging in many countries. Someone does something wrong, they're not trustworthy, and then you're back trying to do it again. But we also can't just give up and be in perpetual war either. So there's a lot more that could be said, but this is kind of a peace-building kind of scheme where he would say all levels of society need to be working toward the peace. And we need to be having a vision of what's after the war. It's not just surviving right now through it and winning. It's trying even now to do those things that can lead to a flourishing society after the war. We're going to talk about transformative initiatives and nonviolence, which is a good way to get there as well, although it does mean pulling back on the violence that is happening now. But if you can be teaching people that as well, then that can be developing a culture that's more peaceful. Okay, very good. From yeah. I know. Yeah, and I think actually you and your group is working on that kind of advocacy, right? Is that correct? Yeah, Henry. And so for past, oh, you're another one too. Yeah. I'm sorry, I didn't quite make that connection. That is probably what needs to also be doing is the work that you're doing is continuing to mobilize allies, the community that's here in the United States and in other countries, to start being noisier, maybe, or making those important connections between power brokers and putting the cause up in front, and getting more allies to do that. The United States is very hard to get to do stuff in many ways, and sometimes the things it does, it's not good. So I would hope that, I don't know, the whole Israel-Hamas thing is very disappointing to me, how much destruction is happening right here. I would hope that if another country gets involved, it would be by helping to facilitate and require a peace process and have penalties for not engaging, trying to do what they can to put world pressure on it, and not simply be choosing one side to give arms. Because I think that's what's perpetuating on the military side. Aren't they getting arms from Russia and China? And that's perpetuating.
Thank you. Time's up. We have got an announcement from Reverend Dr.
Acho ngun kachim lamo abepi abi pi ngai sirwatin tukarwa e anok san minute pangalong sala thantang ni pastor ka tuan leo ka tuan ka te 1984 ahin solfa training krak pek na cho ke mani je mana krak rel lo solfa training kha zan khat sui malam pakhatin zar thum chung zan lenga ka pek na yi never in never chi rim lai never sakshim la ka ti asami dial te kha bei MIT grading pek bantukin kan to ai asa tak tak mi kha adok na ka hla kan chowe kan rem ni khwal rat pawa khala kan rem chema mi athiam to kai kan kan rel cho thiam lo mi long ten se asena in kha sumlam hlinga solfa achong ye training chati in avchit mi ka ing sa to mi ka ti ko lai cho homework to mi kha certificate kan pek na 2 credit kan pek na le zai man akan rel an rel chiao lo na in atui CACCGS atun mi sa za thatte pole pastor thantang an tuana choir competition am hak pe tu digan tia khan am vai chu le ki ma he sa chung le nu pi solfa training o mi na grel lo mo te kan vai ti le a certificate kan ba pia ti se le hak pe tu na dak thim na ti se asa za that tang chu ka te lo mo ama ki chai tel ven ti ta ra rak chon leo si cho ni kha o ke Sunday school la tu tan hi credit kan pek na la atling te na kai ni hi tu tana simlam pangan eng kai zan zan ni thokun mu tu zan le simlam pakan ti kan chong le panga kan re lai voi nan ni chu insan nei lo cha na ji som thumin kan tuak la salomo homework kan pe na assignment kan pe na lo chu cha chun voi ruk dan kai sia chun ve tling la simlam som thum tling lai kha sop atu tan hi completion lo kan pe rin hala mu voi ruk dan pia kho som thum tling lai 2 credit kan pek na la 2 credit chu zo ya dan man lai te chun di min nan rakai te ka khan kha credit kha akhong kan to pek na la nang kai te la chu thai ko ka la kan mu patum rong nang kai te la kha khong kan to pek na lai nu pakhat pa pa ni nang kai te la chu pakhat ma chu long lawin di min cha long sala e ajai dang vial te zo ma khan kan siang in ni credit arakai ve ko ti bi 2 credit ka chu pek ni min kan zom te na la chu cha chun tu tan he atlung ding minan cha athan kanin ka chim cha mi si nan chun hana certificate te kha ilak ta te lo chun pe chu ka so poilo chu ka kai te lun ti jong sil so poilo sama salo kan ma len offer pe kan du min ha chu atu tan he 5 hours nan kai ti mi te completion te kan pek na lai 30 hours atlet te ka kan ni kan 2 credit ki academic term kan chim sia chun mu 2 credit kan pek te thalai nan du na ko nan man te la ti kha chu thong ko ben tan na thong tha kan tan na
kan long coffee din chan salai coffee break 11:50 ya kan da than lai man tlak du min nu ma chun sia Moses ko kho se